Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, to give him his full name, born 1475, died in 1564, so he lived a good age. He was born in Caprese in the city-state of Florence. In his lifetime, he was often called Il Divino, which means the divine one, because it's said of his ability to instill awe in those who came to view his work. He was born into a family of bankers, but when their bank failed, his father, Ludovico, became a judicial administrator, not sure what that is. Several months after Michelangelo's birth, the family had moved to Florence, where he was raised in the foster home of a stone cutter, consequent to his mother's death when he was only 6. His father also owned a quarry, and it was there he became acquainted with the properties of marble. He showed no interest in schooling, preferring to copy paintings in churches in the company of other painters. It must be remembered that at the time, Florence was in the vanguard of the High Renaissance, underpinned by sculptors and painters like Raphael, Da Vinci, Botticelli, Titian, Giorgione, Bellini. They all looked forward to a renewal of classical scholarship and, more importantly, from our point of view, the arts. In 1488, at the age of 13, Michelangelo was apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio. Then the following year, Lorenzo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence, asked Ghirlandaio for his 2 best pupils, and Michelangelo was sent along as one of them. From 1490 to 1492, Michelangelo attended a humanist academy founded by the Medici family. Around this time, he sculpted this low-relief Madonna of the Steps under the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici. He was little more than 16 years old. Unusually, the Virgin lifts her dress to feed or protect the sleeping child, as you can see. So this is a bas-relief. He also produced a bas-relief Battle of the Centaurs, which portrays the mythic battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. It has to be said it's unclear which are the Centaurs and which are the humans. To quote Wikipedia, Pirithous, king of the Lapiths, had long clashed with the neighboring Centaurs. To mark his good intentions, Pirithous invited the Centaurs to his wedding. Some of the Centaurs over-imbibed at the event, and when the bride was presented to greet the guests, she so aroused the intoxicated Centaur Eurytion that he leapt up and attempted to carry her away. So that's the background of this battle. The combatants used rocks to throw at one another, as you can see. For whatever reason, the sculptor has come down to us unfinished. When he was 17, another pupil, Pietro Tongiano, broke his nose. This etching of Michelangelo when he was 70 clearly shows the break which never mended. Vasari, his biographer, tells us Torrigiano, envious of his distinction in art, one day struck him so violent a blow in the face that his nose was broken and crushed in a manner from which it could never be recovered, so that he was marked for life. Whereupon Torrigiano was banished from Florence. Incidentally, this Torrigiano was the sculptor responsible for the tomb of Henry VII in Westminster Abbey. He also made a bust, terracotta bust of Henry VII, which I think is in the National Portrait Gallery. When Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, Michelangelo returned to his father's house. The following year, he bought a block of marble and carved from it a larger-than-life Hercules, which sadly for us has subsequently disappeared. In 1494, Lorenzo's heir, Piero de' Medici, was expelled from Florence upon the arrival of the infamous fanatical friar Savonarola. Michelangelo also left the city, moving to Bologna. He only returned when the political situation had quietened down following the overthrow of Savonarola's government. While in Bologna, at the age of 20, in 1495, he sculpted these three statuettes in the Arca di San Domenico for the tomb of Saint Dominic. It's believed that Proculus on the right is a self-portrait of the artist at the time. Saint Proculus is thought to have been a Roman officer who died around 304 AD. You can see Saint Petronius holds the city of Bologna in his hand on the extreme left there. I haven't gone away. I'm just allowing you to, giving you time to take in the art. The following year, upon the restoration of the Medici, Michelangelo returned to work for the family briefly before leaving for Rome. He was now 21 and began work on a larger-than-life statue of Bacchus, a commission from Cardinal Riario. The god is depicted with bleary eyes, a swollen bladder, and an inebriated toppling stance. It's classical in essence and robustly three-dimensional, so we're encouraged to look at the sculpture from every angle. Bacchus and the satyr were hewn from the same block of marble. Shelley was unimpressed when he saw it, writing, and I quote, it looks like drunken, brutal, and narrow-minded, and has an expression of dissoluteness most revolting. It's certainly not difficult to note the androgynous, decadent nature of the sculpture, but this was Bacchus after all. Destined for the cardinal's garden, he refused it on the grounds it was too sinful. It eventually ended up in the possession of the Medici family. In 1498, a French cardinal, Jean de Billiers, commissioned him to carve the Pieta, which stands now in St. Peter's Basilica today. The contract was agreed in August of the following year. Michelangelo was 24 at the time of its completion. It is today regarded as one of the world's great sculptures. The sculpture is composed, as you can see, in the form of the classical triangle. Vasari wrote, "It is certainly a miracle that a formless block of stone could ever have been reduced to a perfection that nature is scarcely able to create in flesh." It's the only sculpture Michelangelo ever signed, and he only did it because, Vasari tells us, he overheard it being attributed to another sculptor. As is often the case, Mary is depicted too young to be the mother of a 33-year-old. But this perhaps enhances a certain mysticism which surrounds the work. In 1972, a mentally disturbed geologist, Laszlo Toth, attacked the sculpture with a hammer, shouting, "I am Jesus Christ, I have risen from the dead." With 15 blows, he removed Mary's arm at the elbow, knocked off a chunk of her nose, and chipped one of her eyelids. It has been restored, obviously, and is now protected behind bulletproof glass. Now, when I saw, the only time I've actually seen this Pieta in St. Peter's, there was a huge crowd standing round it, but my eyes were drawn to a nun, and she was enraptured. That's all I can think of to describe the look on her face, was one of absolute bliss. She just couldn't take her eyes away from this sculpture. And it's always made an impression on me there. In 1499, Michelangelo returned to Florence. He was there commissioned to complete an unfinished sculpture began 40 years earlier by Agostino di Duccio. It was to be a colossal marble statue of David, 17 feet high, possibly as a symbol of Florentine resistance. He completed it in the years between 1501 and 1504, and because of it was established as a sculptor of the first eminence. Now, these photographs I took myself on a visit to Florence in the early 80s, and they give an indication of the immensity of this work of art, as you can see, compared to the people who were standing around looking up at it. Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Filippino Lippi were amongst those who were called together to decide where it should stand. They decided to site it in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. It took 4 days to move the statue the half-mile from Michelangelo's workshop. These days it is housed in the Accademia Gallery, while a replica occupies its place in the square where it was originally intended. David, intense and primed, is posed before the battle with Goliath. According to the Bible, David refused Saul's offer of armor. He is therefore sculpted as the heroic male nude of antiquity, posed contrapposto with his weight on one foot and half turning to create a dynamic appeal. Vasari commented, "It surpassed all ancient and modern statues, whether Greek or Latin, that have ever existed." And I want to show you some details of his hands, and you can understand why Vasari made these comments, because look at the veins in his hands. Those hands could be flesh. Extraordinary skill. And the fingernails too. While sculpting David, Michelangelo also found time to sculpt the Bruges Madonna, 1501 to 4. This Madonna measures just over 6.5 feet, and you can find it in Bruges Church of Our Lady. The head of the child appears too large, but it's thought that this was deliberate because the Madonna had to be positioned high as an altarpiece. It was bought by 2 cloth merchants from Bruges for 4,000 florins, and is the only one of Michelangelo's works to leave Italy in his lifetime. It doesn't bear comparison with the St. Peter's Basilica, Pieta, I don't think. In 1505, Michelangelo was invited back to Rome by the newly elected Pope Julius II, and he was commissioned to build his tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. It was to include 40 statues and be finished in 5 years. Both men had quick tempers and soon argued. Instead of 5 years, Michelangelo worked on the tomb on and off for the next 40 years, by which time, of course, Julius was long dead. The project was considerably scaled down by that time, with far fewer statues than originally envisaged. And there we have the tomb as it is today. There are no human remains in that tomb, it has to be said. Today it's sited in the church of San Pietro di Vincoli in Rome. The final version contained only 3 sculptures by Michelangelo. And these are the 3 sculptures: Moses, Leah, and Rachel. Center stage is Moses. A passing resemblance to Charlton Heston has often been noted, which may be why the actor was given the role of Moses in the film The Ten Commandments. We don't know. Notice Moses has horns on his head, which is surprising. The horns were a conventional attribute of Moses, consequent to a possible mistranslation in the Latin Vulgate. The translation reads, "He knew not that his face was horned from the conversation with the Lord." So he's horned because he'd spoken with God. It's thought now that the original intended to convey emitting rays or light of some description. Vasari writes, "Seated in a serious attitude, he rests with one arm on the tablets and with the other holds his long glossy beard. The hair is so difficult to render in sculpture, being so soft and downy, that it seems as if the iron chisel must have become a brush. The draperies fall in graceful folds. The muscles of the arms and bones of the hands are of such beauty and perfection." A more recent Guardian article quoted, "Today he glares at the tourists, outfaces them, just as he outfaced Sigmund Freud, who spent 3 weeks in 1913 trying to figure out the sculpture's emotional effect." Freud, in fact, believed that Michelangelo had captured the moment when Moses descended the mountain the first time, carrying the tablets, and found the Israelites worshipping a golden calf, hence his stern expression. Leah was the first wife of the patriarch Jacob. Michelangelo has sculpted her in classical Roman dress. According to his 2 biographers, Vasari and Condivi, she represents the active life based on a passage from Dante. The contemplative life is represented by Rachel, seen praying for salvation through faith. Rachel was Jacob's 2nd wife and the mother of Joseph. Two other statues were intended for the original tomb before it was drastically reduced in scale, but they proved to be too large for the niches in the original design. They're statues of slaves, now known as the rebellious slave and the dying slave, and to be found in the Louvre today, greatly admired there by Rodin, we're told. The 2 figures are shown struggling to be free of the marble and give us a unique insight into his carving technique. So let's leave behind the sculptures for a while and turn our attention to Michelangelo's paintings. In 1507, he was commissioned by Angelo Doni to paint a Holy Family as a present for his wife. It is known as the Doni Tondo, tondo meaning round, or Doni Madonna, and hangs in the Uffizi Gallery in its original impressive frame. It's the only known easel painting by Michelangelo. The small figure on the right, and I take that to be this figure there, is believed to be John the Baptist, but the significance of the 5 male nudes in the background is unresolved. The shading of the bright colors points to the same technique used on the Sistine ceiling. It's generally agreed that the tondo is the least distinguished of Michelangelo's works. Even Doni seems to have been dissatisfied with it, and there was much haggling over the fee, according to Vasari. Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel between the years of 1508 and 1512, persuading Pope Julius II to give him a free hand. Why is it called the Sistine Chapel? Because the man who commissioned it in the 1470s was Pope Sixtus IV, and Sixtus in Italian is Sisto. The project covers 500 square meters of ceiling and contains over 300 figures. Fresco painting is accomplished on a damp lime wash, which serves to bind the pigments together and also to provide the white ground. Only a limited number of colors can be used as pigments because they tend to lighten when they dry. For this reason, the artist applies only as much plaster as will serve for one day's work. In Michelangelo's frescoes, the edges of each day's application can be spotted, and so we can tell how much he achieved in any one day. The ground he worked on comprised of 2 parts marble sand and 1 part plaster. It would be dampened the night before and applied in several layers. The previously prepared drawing or cartoon was cut into sections, each of which represented a day's work. The section was then fastened onto the fresco ground and the outlines traced with an iron stylus. Each section took about 6 weeks to dry. And that all seems quite a performance before you even start to apply your brush to the ground. So here's a close-up of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. At its center are 9 episodes from the book of Genesis, divided into 3 groups. From right to left in this detail, God's creation of the earth, God's creation of mankind, and its fall from God's grace. And lastly, the state of humanity as represented by Noah and his family. On the section supporting the ceiling are painted 7 prophets who prophesied the coming of Christ, and the 5 sibyls or prophetesses from ancient Greece. Now we'll go through 1 or 2 of the more famous sections and have a closer look at them. Among the most famous sections on the ceiling is the creation of Adam. God's right hand is outstretched to create a synapse, the spark of life from his finger to Adam. It's said that Michelangelo dissected many corpses during his artistic career in order to perfect the musculature of the male body. If you look closely, it's said he also included the extra rib destined for the creation of womankind. But I think whether it might be that just there, I don't know. But that's what it's That's what people believe. I think this is the most famous part of the Sistine Chapel, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with it, as you may be with this one. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the temptation and the expulsion, so they were both contained within the same painting. Here we've got the devil as a snake wrapped himself around the trunk of a tree, and he's holding out the forbidden fruit to Eve. I'm not quite sure what Adam is doing there. And then we've got a God figure here with a sword in his hand, or it could be the Archangel Michael. I'm not too sure of my Genesis at this point. Anyway, they're being shown the way out. Adam and Eve are being shown the door, if the garden contains such a thing. This is another famous part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Great Flood, a scene of desperation as humans try to escape drowning, while in the background the ark appears to be still being worked upon. So there's the ark in the background, and we can see to the right and left humanity struggling to escape the flood. And in the center, we've got, well, two things going on in the center. We've got this man carrying this other man to safety, relative safety on this island, but we know it's going to be flooded eventually. And then we've got this curious shaped boat, which is more like a bathtub, really. And that presumably is heading towards the ark. Whether they make it or not, we don't know. But there's a lot of human misery contained in this part, this section. Michelangelo loved to fill his frescoes with people. This is the prophet Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem, and one of the 7 Old Testament prophets. It's been suggested that Michelangelo had painted himself in despair at having to paint at the insistence of the Pope rather than to sculpt. So you'll have to take it, you'll have to decide for yourself whether that's a passing resemblance to Michelangelo. Possibly just about make out a broken nose there, maybe, but it's not very convincing as a portrait, I don't think. You can see how the colors are quite faded because the plaster has soaked in the pigment, I presume. And then this is the famous Cumaean Sibyl, the Cumaean Sibyl painted as an ugly, powerfully built woman ruled over a Greek colony called Cumaea, not surprisingly. She's reading from a large book, which will be significant. Legend has it that she would live for 1,000 years after being blessed by Apollo. She's certainly a very uncompromising woman. So it's a huge subject, the Sistine Chapel, and we can't linger here too long. We'll be back to it again in a short while to look at the altar, the wall over the altar. Back to his sculptors. The Risen Christ, commissioned in 1514, but not completed until 1520, stands nearly 7 foot high. You find it in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, to the left of the main altar. This actually is the second version. In the first, a black vein was discovered in the marble and it had to be abandoned. He sculpted Christ fully nude, as you can see, but a bronze loincloth was added at a later date. It's since disappeared. In 1520, the Medici family approached Michelangelo to construct a freestanding family chapel in the Basilica of San Lorenzo. This is the Medici Chapel. It occupied him for many years. There were to be 4 tombs originally, but only those of Giuliano and Lorenzo Medici were constructed. Two figures on the Giuliano's tomb represent night and day, and the 2 figures on Lorenzo's represent evening and dawn. Michelangelo made no attempt at a likeness of the 2 dukes. He justified this by saying that 1,000 years' time, nobody would know who they were, so it wouldn't matter. There's a certain irony in that, in so much as if he had captured their likeness, then people would certainly know what they look like anyway. His assumption is that nobody would care in 1,000 years' time, and maybe they won't. The Madonna and Child was a late addition to the chapel and is unfinished if seen from the rear. The Virgin Mary appears to be denying her breast to the Christ child, possibly because she's been posed sitting with her right arm behind her, gripping the edge of the seat, and is failing to hold him to her embrace. So it's a curious pose that Michelangelo has created there, and you can see her arm there. Well, it disappears behind her, so the assumption, we see it on this side, but the assumption is that she's stopping herself from falling. Why he would paint her like that, we don't know. St. Cosmo and St. Damien sit either side of the Madonna. Shortly before his death, in 1534, Pope Clement commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. So we're now back in the Sistine Chapel. The artist worked on it from 1536 to 1541. The largest fresco in Rome, and painted exclusively by Michelangelo, depicts the second coming of Christ, showing souls either rising to heaven or falling and being dragged down to hell. There's a blend of biblical narrative and mythology within the fresco. Michelangelo portrayed Jesus as an imperious macho figure without the conventional beard and certainly well muscled. At the Council of Trent, shortly before the artist's death, it was decided to mask the genitals, and Daniele de Volterra, one of his apprentices, was commissioned to make the alterations. Originally, all the figures were painted nude. The wall for the fresco was built sloping so that it overhung at the top to prevent the accumulation of dust. The fresco consists of 3 sections, the top being the kingdom of heaven, where Christ, in the company of the Virgin, stands in judgment. Around them in the inner circle is an inner circle of apostles on the right and the patriarchs on the left. Maybe I'll go back and you can see that more clearly. So then the next slide, on the left of the middle section, those who have been judged ascend to heaven, while on the right, the damned begin their descent. No, I think I got that the wrong way around, haven't I? Anyway, you can see by the titles on the top, the damned are cast out on the left here, And on the right, the righteous are ascending towards heaven. In the center, angels blow trumpets to awaken the dead, while the archangel Michael reads the names of those to be saved from the book of souls. And there's the archangel Michael. And on the right here, we have the resurrection of the dead. The bottom of the fresco shows the resurrection of the dead, as I just said, and also Karen and demons and the damned. And Karen, of course, you won't find Karen in the Old Testament. So that's with Greek mythology being mixed up with biblical law. I feel sorry for this damned soul on the right here. I've often felt like that myself, I must say. Maybe I'm a damned soul as well, I don't know. Cardinal Baggio da Cesena criticized the frescoes, saying that the paintings would be more at home in a public tavern. To get his own back, Michelangelo painted him in as Minos, a prince of hell. So there he is. That's a portrait of the man who, of the cardinal who's unwise to criticize Michelangelo. And on the left here, it said that in the skin of Bartholomew that's been held there by the saint, he has managed to paint himself again. We've got to take it on trust that that is assumed to be a self-portrait, and I think we can see a broken nose there anyway. While still working on the Last Judgment, Michelangelo received yet another commission from the Vatican. This was for the paintings of two very large frescoes in the Cappella Paolina, depicting significant events in the lives of the two most important saints of Rome: the conversion of St. Paul, and there it is. And again, as you can see, Michelangelo has completely filled it with characters and figures, and either from celestial figures and at the top, or the retinue of St. Paul. There's poor St. Paul on the ground, been thrown from his horse by the sudden intervention of Jesus Christ there, who seems to be throwing some sort of a bolt down towards him. And these are really seriously huge paintings, 20 foot by 21 foot. And then we have the crucifixion of St. Peter, again, the same size, obviously. Not quite so many figures in this painting. 100 years later, if you remember from the Rubens talk, he painted the same two scenes, if you like, either side of the altar in a, I can't remember the church now, but presumably he got his inspiration from the Michelangelos, because St. Peter very similarly is posed in the Rubens to the way he's posed here. And I particularly remember the crouching man taking the weight of the cross. And of course, St. Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't want to compete with Jesus Christ. So that was his own intervention. The figure standing in the upper left corner, and I'm going to point to him there now, or circle him, that this, we are told, is also a self-portrait of Michelangelo. And it's thought, we know that because of the blue turban that he's wearing, which was often worn by Renaissance sculptors to keep the dust from their hair. But he's such a small figure there that you can't make any real feature. You can't make his. You certainly can't see his broken nose. Although maybe if because it's such a huge painting, maybe you could if you were standing in front of it. Anyway, the experts tell us that that is possibly a self-portrait. Now this definitely is a portrait of Michelangelo. We've already met the character Daniele del Vatera, his apprentice, and this is a portrait of Michelangelo at the age of 70. So we've got a very good idea now of the mature Michelangelo, what he looked like, and I would assume that that is a pretty accurate portrait, and certainly the broken nose is there for all to see. It must be remembered that besides being a genius as a sculptor and painter, he was also no mean architect. In 1546, Michelangelo was appointed architect to St. Peter's Basilica, Rome. His main objective was to replace the 4th century basilica. He strengthened the building both physically and visually. The dome has been called the greatest creation of the Renaissance, but was not completed until some time after his death. It influenced the building of churches for many centuries, including our own St. Paul's Cathedral and many domes on public buildings throughout the UK, of course. Among his architectural projects, he worked the Piazza di Capitolione Hill, which contained the bronze statue of Marcus Aurelius. So the design of this piazza is down to Michelangelo. He also designed the upper floor of the Palazzo Farnese, which is now the French embassy. In his old age, Michelangelo created a number of Pietas, of which this is the most distinguished, the Florentine Pieta. Michelangelo again depicts himself, this time as Nicodemus. He somehow smashed the left arm and leg of the figure of Jesus, and it was left to one of his pupils to repair the sculpture. And I don't think he's done a particularly good job on this arm anyway. It still looks as though Christ is sculpted with a broken arm. And note that Christ's left leg is missing. Vasari tells us that because of his great age, there were few finished works from him in this late period. And you can certainly see it at the bottom there, and the pedestal, that the stone is unsmooth. In fact, you don't have to look too hard at the sculpture to see that it's unfinished. The last sculpture, begun in 1552, Michelangelo worked on up to 6 days before his death, was the unfinished Rondanini Pieta in Milan. And that is barely started, never mind unfinished. Michelangelo died in Rome in 1564 at the great age of 88. His body was interred in the Basilica of Santa Croce, Florence, and Vasari was commissioned to design and build his tomb. It took over 14 years to complete. So there is the tomb of Michelangelo with yet another likeness. Michelangelo once said, "However rich I may have been, I have always lived like a poor man." And he was rich, richer than most dukes and princes of his time, and yet a solitary man preferring his own company. We're told by his contemporary biographers he cared little for food and drink, and often slept in his clothes and boots. One biographer says, and I quote, "His nature was so rough and uncouth that his domestic habits were incredibly squalid." Speculation about any relationships he may have had is sourced from his poetry. He actually wrote over 300 sonnets. He never married. Was he gay? We don't know. Vasari tells us he loved Tommaso de Cavalieri, a Roman gentleman for whom, being a young man, he made many most superb drawings. Scholars agree that Michelangelo was infatuated with Cavalieri, and a large body of his poems are indeed addressed to him. Cavalieri's response was, I quote, "Never have I loved a man more than I love you." On the other hand, late in life, he developed a great platonic love for the widow and poet Vittoria Colonna, already in her 40s. Because of his reclusive nature, Michelangelo had little to do with the other giants of the High Renaissance, Da Vinci and Raphael, whom he survived by more than 40 years. So let's leave the last word to Vasari, his main biographer. Of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he wrote, "The work has proved a veritable beacon to our art, of inestimable benefit to all painters, restoring light to a world that for centuries has been plunged into darkness. For this work contains every perfection possible."